In the digital reality, evolution over revolution prevails. The QA approaches and techniques that worked yesterday will fail you tomorrow. So free your mind. The Automation Cyborg has been sent back in time. TED speaker Jonathan Wright's mission is to help you save the future from bad software.
All right.
Hello, Nico. How's it going?
Oh, good, Jonathan. Thanks for having me. And I have tons of questions for you today.
Wonderful. Well, this is going live stream across the world on numerous channels. We're also going to put it onto testtalks.com, which is also a podcast series. So this will be available on YouTube as well, on the testing-world.com website as well. So we're going to do this, and obviously it's on live on LinkedIn and numerous other available channels. So yeah, Nico, before you get into introducing me, why don't I just do a quick one of introducing yourself, as you're going to be the hostess with the mostest today.
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm Nico Carnival, and I'm a product marketing manager here at Keysight. Love working with Jonathan. He's very supportive of everything that we do on the customer initiatives front. And yeah, I think today we just wanted to talk about some exciting stuff that's coming up. I had tons of questions, and Jonathan was like, "Do you want to do a live stream?" I said, "Sure, why not?" So that's my intro, and I'll go right back to you. So Jonathan, before we start, and I know a lot of you are already seeing Jonathan live, or you attended one of his webinars, or might be familiar. But for the people that don't know you, can you just give a quick overview of like your background? Where does your passion for testing come from, and all that sorts of stuff?
Yeah, no, great question. And so yeah, so my legacy story, I suppose, or is going all the way back to the 90s. Actually, and I started off as a manual tester, which I think is quite interesting for today's session. And I was working at a large German communication company, and they just handed me over this huge book of requirements and test cases, and that said to me, "Okay, off, go into the lab for the 6 weeks between my university breaks, and go and test this PABX system, and then eventually onto some voice over IP." And so I was kind of pretty much just stuck in a lab with all these kind of questions about, well, what is SIP, SIP, what is VoIP, what are all these technologies that I'm testing? And I wasn't a domain expert, and I wasn't really a manual tester with a whole stack of testing patterns. And I was kind of following some manual test scripts. And that started me on my passion for automation. And 4 decades later, we're still kind of solving the same problems and the same challenges, I suppose.
Wow. You don't look that old, mate. You're doing well. Good skincare routine, honestly. But 3 or 4 decades, well done. I imagine a lot has changed. We were talking a bit earlier about your TEDx that was about 5 years ago, and you're discussing cognitive engineering. From that time to today, like, what's changed?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, I hit the 100 events over the last conference season. So the conference season is thankfully just finishing as the festivities start up. And obviously I've been talking about AI-augmented testing or generative AI for the last 12 months at various different conferences around the world. And I've been kind of, I suppose, asking that same question, what has changed since I started talking, when I did my TED talk around cognitive engineering and machine learning and artificial intelligence. What's really changed? What's changed today versus, and obviously there's so much noise in the industry around GPT and chat GPT. Has this really changed the forefront of technology and artificial intelligence? And I think the answer is probably no. But also the answer is probably it's got into a lot more people's hands. I think a lot more people have seen or have used these kind of platforms, especially in the last 12 months. And a kind of a bit more understanding of what, a subset of artificial intelligence around large language models can actually do for them in their, general day-to-day lives, whether that's writing essays or just trying to find out information about something they don't know, which Google and Ask Jeeves have been doing for decades now. But so has things changed? And I kind of joked in the sense of saying no, but when I did the talk, I talked about Turing and also Hewlett Packard back in 1939, which is the Keysight heritage story about build and test, and that incremental design, post-agile kind of approach. And then I talked a little bit about, Turing and those early days and the singularity. And within that singularity story is, of course, this view of narrow intelligence versus general intelligence. And of course, we're still very on the narrow form. It does feel a bit more general, but it isn't. And then we're not anywhere on that trajectory towards the singularity. And really, I think this is where I think things have changed a little bit, in the sense of what 5-6 years ago I was kind of saying. And Oxford University at the time, I put this slide in the backdrop which said which are the jobs that will be targeted first, and the ones I said were things like legal and maybe industry focused ones, and then at the opposite end, the ones that weren't going to be targeted were things like creativity and art, and really, actually, if we've seen what's happened in maybe the last 2-3 years with GAN, so generative adversarial networks, we've seen actually great creativity coming out of these systems. Their ability to generate images through things like DALL-E is phenomenal. And I think now people are realizing actually the creativity component could be something they've targeted first. And I think that is probably when we come into looking at things like generative AI. We've really looked at what are the problems that everybody is trying to solve today, and maybe they're still not in a professional context, as in, how do I, when I'm in a room in a lab and I'm trying to test a complex system, how do I understand how to go about it? Whereas actually, if I ask it a question around Brazil, it'll probably give me a very good understanding of what you would celebrate at Christmas and some of the traditions, because it's able to have the knowledge of the world, shall we say.
I agree with you. I think sometimes when you go to look for some information in Google, because nowadays it's not about the right information, it's who has the best SEO, and you have like all the ads and everything. I think that ChatGPT sometimes can just give you that answer. It's a nice and consumable way. So, as a search engine, I think it's a lot better. And I've tried a few different ones as well. But I do have another question for you. In terms of like the trends and emerging technologies that came, I know that AI and Gen AI are probably like one of the highest ones on that list. But how do you see these trends shaping up the future of testing? Anything specific about Gen AI? Like, well, what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. What does the future hold? And I think part of what we've seen is a rapid investment in these generative AI technologies. And I think what we haven't seen is probably the use cases which have added value to efficiency on day-to-day domain and industry-based jobs, right? We've seen a lot of publications around, it's past the bar, but it's not able to become illegal, a practice law, in the same as it outperforms medical students with 5 years experience, but it's not able to do live surgery. So, I think part of it is it's a step in the right direction, and you can kind of straight away understand that actually it's a human in the loop symbolic relationship that really what we're trying to achieve is that actually we still need the human to validate what is coming out of these systems, in the same way we validated what we got from returns from Google, which was kind of the problem. We would type something into our favorite search engine, and the next 3 articles we'd say, well, actually, I've diagnosed myself with something because I've read md.com, and now I feel like I can make the same diagnosis as a medical doctor. And the answer is you probably can't, right? You very easy to say, I will attempt to do that based on, understanding and interpreting the data, but actually you need a specialist still in the loop. And I think this is where things get really interesting, is how do you augment the scientists, the surgeons, the healthcare professionals, the, industry experts to be able to do even more with less. And I think this is a theme probably we've seen post-COVID anyway, is, we're now working remotely without being in a collab kind of environment. When I'm stuck on a question, who do I ask? And I think this is where I think there is a real great opportunity, is that it's starting to understand how organizations work. And I think this was always the challenge, the people, process, technology kind of standard kind of approach is, okay, well, how do I understand how I do business compared to how maybe a competitor does business? What's the magic sauce that we do within our systems of systems? And I think that's where it's really interesting, is that actually, if you can create, and this was kind of my prediction probably over a year ago, is if you could create a specific GPT to an industry, so a healthcare one, but also a healthcare one that knows testing, or a healthcare one that knows development or IoT, practices, is that actually those tuned models could be really powerful. And in the same way, we're developing, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but we're developing, aerospace and defense with 6G, for instance, as an example, as 6G capabilities come online. These cutting edge technologies plus industry suddenly mean it's going to have a lot better understanding. And I could envision myself back when I was in my, in my teens or my late teens, being sat in that lab room going, well, what's voice over IP? And it literally saying, okay, here's the different protocols that the SIP protocols that you've got to test. This is the silent suppression algorithm that it uses. So to invoke it, you need to do these type of tests. And then, as I'm not an experienced tester, it could also help me with, well, maybe you could build a classification tree to build each scenario up. So different types of phones ring in other different phones with different protocol standards. This would be an effective test, which I would have no exposure to, because I wouldn't be a telco specialist, as well as I wouldn't be a testing specialist when I started my early days career. So I think that's where things get really interesting.
No, this is great, Jonathan. Thanks for sharing. I was as you were talking, I was remembering, when I was a kid, and it was a matter of, we didn't have as much information digitally. We're still like, oh, I have to go to the library, write down the chapter of the book, etc. And now it's the opposite. We have so much information digitally that we need to find, okay, what is the right one? As you mentioned, in some very regulated sectors like healthcare, it could mean that it's extremely important because it might be like a mission critical system or anything like that for ANZ as well. So on that topic and what you've been discussing about Gen AI, what can you share about latest product developments, or is there anything like that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, sure. So, I think that's probably a good place to talk about what we've been working on for the last year. And so we've been working on what we've referred to as lovingly as the synthetic domain expert, but really think of it as a subject matter expert, which has that exact same capability. It's its own tuned large language model that knows about testing as a domain, and an industry verticals such as healthcare or any, aerospace and defense or telco as examples. And it's, it's completely offline. And, I guess, most people would probably say at this point in time, well, who cares whether it's offline? And, a lot you've probably seen from my LinkedIn post, but a lot of the EU AI Act, in a similar way to GDPR and then the California Data Privacy Act, is going to come in force next year. And you're going to see less and less usage of public facing and public trained GPTs, right? I think partly we have the concern of where this information comes from in the first place. In the same way, using your search engine, the first 8 or 9 articles, how does it know where they're coming from? And as you pointed out earlier, it's SEO, right? It's partly who's paying the most gets you higher up in the ranks. So there's a question around trustworthiness of these systems, and I think that's the first primary concern. And then the second one is privacy, right? Data privacy. We've all now understand post Cambridge Analytica days the importance of our own privacy of our data and what we can and cannot share. And with that in mind, you probably don't want to be sharing IP from your organization. Or I probably put this in a harder sense, is you should not be under any circumstances sharing IP from your organization with a public facing GPT. And so therefore that is kind of where I think I've seen a lot of other people ask GPT to create test cases for them, or create scenarios or test data, and there's certain use cases where you could probably say, well, it's quite harmless, right? If you're asking it to create synthetic data generation for a generic retail retail application, then fine, right? I think it's not a problem. But if you're in a mission critical landscape, then absolutely not, right? You shouldn't be asking it certain information that maybe reveal information about your organization or patient details or anything like that. So offline definitely is super important. And the next thing is around is around this kind of domain and expertise area. So, we know these GPTs pretty much coming out every other day, a new flavor, whether it be Llama from people like Meta, or, the Mixtral mix, which we use at the moment, which is the 8x7B large language model. Again, you really need to be able to take a base model which performs reliably to a high accuracy, and then you need to take that and then you need to tune it on what you're asking it to do. So in our case, we're in the testing domain, right? So testing it, passing it things like ISTQB, testing terminology from different accredited sources is important, so that it understands testing. And I use the word kind of very similar to Neo in the sense of saying, I know Kung Fu. It now knows testing, right? Yes, it takes a bit of time to tune, and you wouldn't want to tune it yourself or fine tune the model yourself, because it would, it would definitely leave your bank balance quite dry. But, part of it is once you fine tune the model to be better at testing, then, you get the benefits of being able to ask it anything, and it comes back with a response, but also a response coming from a credible source, which it will actually tell you. It's only GPTs that we've used, like OpenAI, that don't tell you where the source of what the information comes from, because it's got legal impacts, right? There's been a lot of noise in the industry around confidential and maybe even proprietary data has appeared on these GPTs, and they shouldn't have. So, but most of the large language models will tell you exactly where it got the source from in the first place. So that's the next stage, is, tune it so that it knows Kung Fu or knows testing, and it also knows your industry. So it knows, healthcare or your specialism in your particular field of expertise. And then the final bit, which I think is actually the hardest bit, and it's something maybe, again, people haven't really done, is looking at the things like RAG architectures and the retrieval approaches of how they look at information. So what we've been building is allows you to feed sources of knowledge, sources of trust. So if you kind of look at the new model for testing by Paul Gerard, it talks about sources of trust or sources of knowledge. And so you can feed it everything, right? You can feed it your confluences, your specification documents, your entire test repo if you really want to. And then it will use that as in essence, as a retrieval mode for reference information. So that IP sensitive information, completely secure, offline, never goes to the internet. And, you know, it allows people to actually then query your special source. So if you want to say, you know, how does this system work? You know, what's the, you know, the parameters that it should operate within. If you're in automotive, say, it could be braking tolerance rates for certain temperatures, you know, you'd have to look that up. Whereas this then builds that information and says, oh, I can tell you it's 46 or 48 under heavy braking, under heavy rain or something. So suddenly it knows not only Kung Fu, but it also knows your special industry which you sit in, which is, again, makes it so that it becomes like a Keysight large language model, or a, you know, your favorite car manufacturer large language model. It starts knowing a lot more that's specific to that company and that company only. And then it's got the industry knowledge behind it. And then you've got the next level, which is also knowledge graphs. And knowledge graphs are representation of information. Again, really important, because you've got to understand the relationship between information that's happening. So, you know, in the US, this should happen. In the UK, this should happen on the 31st of this leap year next year. This, you know, accounting thing should happen. You know, part of it needs to understand and be able to reference the knowledge graph of where the information's relates to. And this is what we've kind of seen for a lot of things like digital twin definition languages and a few more digital twin kind of moves, which we've been doing quite a lot recently, introducing digital twin technology to understand systems of systems better. That then builds up an even better model of being able to understand and reference complex systems. So that's kind of the journey in a way. And it also the new capabilities. So it doesn't sound like it's really that exciting, but when you put all of what I've just said together, it means, you know, reboot Jonathan, 18-year-old Jonathan, you know, he would have not only been able to understand everything that company did and how they configured the PABXs and the SAP, the SIP protocols and everything else, and their proprietary IP. It would know telco. It would know everything to do with communications and read all the documentation for every one of the systems that I was talking to. And then more importantly, which is where I guess everyone's probably listening to, is it generates the tests. So it would have said to me, okay, yeah, you've got a book full of 100,000 tests, which you've been told to do for 6 months. And the extension of that story was 6 months later, I went back to my boss at the time, a guy called Brian, and I handed him the book, which was a physical piece of paper. And I said to him, look, I'm completely, you know, being honest, you know, I've tested every single one of those 8,442 combinations of phone A rings phone B and then hangs up and then rings phone C. I've done every single one of those combinations, and I've worked relentlessly for 12 hours a day because I had that level of enthusiasm, as you are when you're coming out of university, for six weeks consistently. And he turns around to me and he said, well, I believe you, you know, because they've never failed, and they've not failed for the last 12 years. And at that point in time, part of my heart stopped, in the sense of, he knew it was going to pass. They were all going to pass. And they'd done this every 6 months or whatever the release cadence was for the last 12 years. And the systems had always worked. And I was checking. I wasn't really testing. And more importantly, you know, I wasn't really adding any value, because I was just proving that what was true for the last 12 years was the same. And at that point in time, I kind of swore never to do manual testing again. And then secondly was like, there must be a way to automate this 6 weeks of work, so that the next person coming in doesn't have to do it, who was coming back off holiday, ironically. And then I spent the next 3 years of that organization fully automating that system with an abacus, which was not, unfortunately, one of those things you move across, but it was a digital automation system for PABXs, which would auto call everything. And you know, it was the not punch cards, but kind of binary kind of based system. And that person was no longer required. So there is an opposite side to this. I think the human is still very valuable, and that human would have added value if they were able to think about, well, what questions, what tests should I write? And this system would have actually helped this guy say, you know, okay, well, these are the next 24 tests that you should try, which are completely unique, never been tested before, and have a good chance of breaking the system. And I think the domain expertise of testers, manual testers, exploratory testers is so much more valuable when you've got the power of an AI augmented testing engine behind it, which is feeding you, well, what do you think? You know, would this happen if while it's on its boot up process, you pulled out the back cable, or when it's on the boot up process, you tried to make a call before it had, you know, connected to the VoIP server? You know, you could try running all of these weird permutation, the chaos engineering landscapes, and, you know, you could still find value. And the domain expert would say, well, actually, that's not going to add any value, or that might add value. So this is the thing is, revolutionarily, 2024 is going to be a huge year, because we're going to start seeing solutions like the synthetic domain expert, which is going to start augmenting testing to help both supercharge and give superpowers to manual testers, but at the same time generate all of the automation assets and all the models and all the tests that they need, and tell them the right test and the right next test. And, you know, I joke, but, you know, my Christmas dinner with Gareth on Friday, I kind of said to him, you know, this is beyond automation, that actually this could be classed as a fully sentient tester if we look at the technology, because it looks at the screen at that moment in time and says, I know what I should be testing next, because I know Kung Fu, but I also know everything about this entire organization that's ever been written down. And I've also got 40 billion reference points that I can potentially tap into. And this sentient tester isn't going to replace manual testers, but it isn't automation, because automation, in the same way Dorothy Graham talked about it in the 60s, 70s, is that if you automate something, the chances of likelihood of finding any issues with that is slim to none. Even with data and keyword driven approaches, you know, it's still, you know, is just testing the same thing what you've gone through a manual tester, whereas a sentient tester is as alive as you are, or not, hopefully, but, you know, we'll actually go and test this with a brain, an AI synthetic brain behind it, thinking of every single possible permutation or path, infinite probability engine from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. It will know more than what the answer to the world of 42 is, but it would at least try 42 in a postcode field at the very least. But anyway, I know that was a very long extension, but that's kind of this is literally a Turing kind of spot where we've gone into a new direction, and we've now realized that after 3-4 decades that automation may be not the answer, but it's the beginning of the rest of what could be unlocked with this kind of capability, and leveraging synthetic knowledge across your organization to power testing like it's never been tested before.
I love it. I love the reference as well, Jonathan. The Kung Fu from Matrix and the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. I think I'm binge watching Suits as well, and one of the main characters, Mike Ross, has like this photographic memory, and you've seen these in movies, you've seen these in technology, where there's like this desire of just like having this information ready to consume, and it's almost like a superpower. So we've taken a little bit less emphasis on the technology and more like on the person that's going to be using the technology. In a few sentences, like what would you say is the biggest benefit for the testers that will be using that? Like what do you think they'll be able to achieve? How's that going to make their life, the work life better? Like what would you say?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, you know, I'll do this as a bit of a live demo just to throw you back in the mix. And while we were just been talking, I've just literally pulled down a open source offline large language model, not our large language model, because that would take me way too long to be able to configure it and get it working while we're on a conversation. but let me just share it, and I'm going to get you to ask it a question in a true kind of don't ever do anything live kind of way. So this is actually just a llama model, so it's very small, even though I do have 64 gig and two Tesla 24 gig cards in here. But I've just added it a whole stack of documentation around testing. So what would you ask it? And more importantly, how would you ask it?
Ooh, that's a tough question. Does it have to be about testing? Do you want it about anything?
Anything? That's the whole point. It could be about the entire world.
Okay. Can you explain me how generative AI works?
And now you get the great bit, unless it crashes, which it usually does, or LangChain crashes, is that I am now using my GPU, all 24 of them, to get that, to give you that response. Now, you probably noticed by this indicator on the right-hand side, this will probably take 30 seconds for it to do, because I'm not using my GPUs at this point in time. So, you know, this is, in essence, gives you a bit of a feeling of what actually generative AI is, because this is now having to use what they refer to as tokens, and we'll see in a second that there's a lot of tokens per second that have been pushing through. So even though it feels like it's not really doing anything, it's doing a lot from a neural net kind of perspective. And what we're building, which has actually got graph neural nets, GNN, to feed in the graph stuff, that just makes it exponentially even longer, which is why if you ask this same question using our synthetic subject matter expert, it would take 5 minutes without any kind of acceleration or DPU, or a dedicated processing unit. But you know, our first version, which we're releasing in early January 2024, will actually run on consumer hardware. So the idea, which is why this machine exists, is to be able to run it just using a CPU, but switch it and turn this little 0 to 1 once you decide to unlock it with the capability of using something like an Apple Studio or something, which has unified memory and can push these large models. So an 8 times 7B is about 36 to 48 gigabytes, which is quite big, and will not run in your standard, your graphics card, which either your PS5 or your Xbox has, right? So this is a real kind of gives you an idea of just how much is needed, right? And so, here's the explanation of what it's trying to explain. So it's broken it down. It's explained it's generative universal networks, which we've talked about, consists of two neural networks that generate new content, variation autoencoders, and then what could generative AI can be used for? Well, for you, especially in marketing landscape, it can be content correction, right? The creation, and you might have seen the new mashup of a Santa store with a hip hop track. It's starting to create music because it can understand music and all sorts of other things. So I think part of it is it can do kung fu. It can do anything you ask it to do, but you've got to understand the structure of what you're asking it. And this is the interesting part about what we've actually done, is that we use what we call prompt tuning, which is in essence not asking it just one question, it's asking it a series of questions. So the idea before is you gave it the question of how would generative AI works, but you say in the context of marketing, as I'm a marketeer, and I'm working on a project which is all about SEO optimization, or optimizing a session like today's audience or impressions. You ask it 9 or 10, 15 questions, depending what it is, depending on the flow of how it goes through. And then what you get out the other side is something which is quite consistent, because you're in essence, there's lots of tools that you can use to say, well, this is what I expect the answer to come back as, right? So if you want to post something on Twitter, it'll say, well, if the answer exceeds 255 characters, which obviously isn't a limit anymore, but you could then tell it must come in this, it must, mention as many, high profiling, keywords as possible to, get it the most impressions. And you could refine it to the perfect tweet. We can't use the word tweet because it's now x.com. So we call it X or whatever it is that you've just sent. I think it's called post. But, you get the idea is that what good looks like in your industry. And what this does is it allows you to refine that to say, okay, this is what good looks like. And I want the consistency that every time it's a winner. And I know what the impression should look like. So I can measure success off if I do put that post out, that I get the expected response that I'm doing. So it's applicable to every industry and every domain. But the real special sauce is in the prompt tuning for the questioning and the axioms that you expect. So I'm expecting a test strategy. Once you've written my test strategy, I'm going to look at it and say, there's no entry or exit criteria. There's no non-functional requirements defined, and there's no performance metrics. And within those performance metrics, I've got no volumetrics versus profile type of stress spike, what SOAP testing. My SOAP testing doesn't have the right duration on it, doesn't have the amount of users on it. Those axioms for each component are defined within the graph that actually then it can say, well, it's not a valid test strategy. So I'm going to give you that back and say, work harder on defining me the non-functional requirements against this system, which is SAP overnight batch with 4 terabytes or 1 petabyte of data. How long should this take on this hardware? There's no way, well, there is a way a human would do that, but they'd be very unhappy going through and trying to understand all the dimensions, whereas this can do it in 8 to 10 minutes while you're having your coffee, your favorite coffee brand, which I know I now shouldn't be advertising.
No, this been great, Jonathan. Honestly, thank you so much for taking the time and going through it. I can definitely see the value, understand a bit more about Gen AI, and how I could leverage, especially on my role. And yeah, it was great speaking with you today. Hope you have a good one, and thanks everyone for watching.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.